Feminism and debating. This should be pretty simple. I will take you through some stock analysis, impacting, characterizing the movement, that kind of stuff, all of which is essential for understanding how to do feminist debates, but it's also all like reasonably applicable or can be used in debates that aren't like immediately either about feminism or use the kind of analysis style or the techniques that we'll be discussing to talk about other movements. Great. I have two title slides for some reason. This is part of a series of videos that I'm doing at the moment on like social justice, soft motions, narratives, movements. So I'll reference some other videos just to encourage you to watch as many of the things that I make as possible. We're all about achieving views. But great, moving on. Feminism and debating. Okay. I'll give a brief overview of movement characterization. I will preface by saying that the overview that I'm going to give is firstly quite West biased. So I'm going to be talking about the way that the feminist movement, as it's traditionally conceived of in the West, emerged and the waves that we talk about there. It becomes more global later on when we're talking like third and fourth waves and with the origin of the internet. But this is the way that the feminist movement has evolved in like Britain, France, US, across Europe, that kind of stuff. If you want a more like detailed approach than I'm going to give, then do your own reading. I'll give some book recommendations at the end of the presentation, and then also additionally, if you want some more like less West specific characterization, again, I'll give some recommendations of like articles or books that you can read. On that, I think that it is useful to have like to read like feminist arguments or books or disagreement, like written discourse, because I think it offers like nuances to the problems that people are trying to address, and you can apply like similar problem solving analysis that you see in those in debates as you use it. But going into like some consideration of the movement, firstly, let's talk about the waves. Broadly speaking, the feminist movement is conceived of as being split into four waves. The first wave looks like the origins of feminism. This is like when people are talking about like the suffragists and the suffragettes. So this is like the basic fight for like legal recognition as a person. So women trying to be identified as people or humans rather than as property. So Wollstonecraft's Declaration of Vindication of the Rights of Women is sort of exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about here. I think it's also important to note that, and often maybe sometimes misconceived, reproductive and divorce rights, but mainly reproductive rights, have been central to feminism since its origins, like in this kind of first wave. This is part of the conversation that emerges in feminism as soon as it begins. Moving on then, second wave feminism. This looks like the kind of 50s, 60s movement. It's inspired by the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests that take place in the US. So note here the entanglement of dissent within states. So one protest movement can cause others to reassess their own situation and protest in a similar way. So inspired by includes both like the political or philosophical, I guess, inspiration, as well as the inspiration of like actual techniques of protest. Both of those things are the inspiration that we're talking about here. The subject matter of these disputes were the questioning of the institutions that hold women back. So whether that's like legal institutions, women being prevented from entering certain workforces, unequal pay disputes, and then also the fight for like reproductive rights and the legal recognition of reproductive rights. So second wave feminism is very much like this kind of anti-patriarchy movement. I think this is where we see the origin of like the institutional understanding, or the way understanding of the way that institutions hold up patriarchal objections. But this is also where we see the beginning of like this, well, is it? I mean, radical is like something that probably exists in first wave, but this is where people like denote the beginning of like radical mainstream and liberal feminisms splintering into different kind of movements. More on that in a bit. And then there's also this kind of questioning of like social and cultural values. But that cultural question is really central to third wave feminism. So this looks like the understanding of the way that culture holds different people back, or that there is different application of culture. Third wave feminism is mainly understood as like originating or beginning in the 90s, and one of the main things that it's credited with is this idea of like sexual freedom becoming increasingly important or central to the notion of what it is to be feminist. So this is also when the terms intersectionality and intersectionality is kind of credited from. So Kimberly Crenshaw is, I think, usually understood as the first person who talks about intersectionality, that being the way that different movements necessarily, or different minority or oppressive situations interact with each other. So the way that being a Black bisexual woman will necessarily incur different social and oppressive structures than just being a white straight woman might. And the need for intersectionality within feminism is really pushed within third wave. Although note the fact that the second wave feminism and its origins are also kind of understanding that kind of intersectionality, although without necessarily having the word to describe it. But additionally, third wave feminism and the emergence of the internet sees a lot of like perspective sharing and an increasingly diverse number of people engaging with the movement, and also a more global nature of the movement emerging. So then finally, then fourth wave feminism, this is kind of considered as what the feminism we're currently in is. This is incredibly complex because of the nature of like cyber feminism and the internet. It's really hard for us to have some kind of like definitive reckoning about like what feminism is, because there are so many people participating and competing ideas and competing individuals saying it. I think it's also become like more of a culturally hegemonic term, i.e. I think it's pretty accepted to say that you're feminist. It's no longer a feminist. It's no longer necessarily considered something that is hugely revolutionary, or that you have to have dictate your entire life for the majority of people. You can say that you're a feminist and not necessarily have to do anything about that, which again means that it sort of distills or potentially dilutes rather, or potentially adds questions as to what being a feminist necessarily is. So the fourth wave is characterized by cyber feminism, so this like internet push. That also looks like things like the hashtag #MeToo movement, which take place predominantly over the internet or through like journalist discourse or like Twitter or whatever. But it's also characterized by clashing, splintered movements. So this looks like this like turf battle against like other feminists battles, or what was the word that I saw recently? Swerve, that's it. Sex work, exclusionary, radical feminist. Yeah, so that's another one. So yes, but I also think that it's also central in this idea of like technological development. Like there's a lot of development and innovation about products and things that are meant to improve the lives of women specifically, is another thing that kind of comes through fourth wave feminism, whether that's like better reproductive products or reproductive healthcare, or what. And again, intersectionality is crucial within fourth wave feminist discourse. So on splintering, I've got a couple of examples here. I think probably through the presentation, my own flavour of feminism will like slowly be revealed. So, you know, take potentially what I say with a pinch of salt. But splintering within the feminist movement and within any social justice movement seems inevitable, especially in the like cyber age, when people are communicating in a less kind of like centralized or centralized way. So I've got a couple of examples here. I'm actually going to start at the bottom. I think that a common way that people talk about it is like feminism just means that you believe in equality between men and women, and I don't think that that's true. I think that, I mean, some people think that it's true, so like fine. I don't think that this is true, because I think that equality has such a diverse understanding, or like a lot of different people understand different things to mean equality, and therefore this seems to me to be an insufficient definition. But it taps into the idea of like whether or not to be a feminist means that you need to be a active participant within a movement, or whether or not it's just enough to say that you stand behind the ideas of something. So then above that, and hugely contrasting this, is the idea of like radical feminism. So this is generally predicated on the idea of like a necessity of revolution in order to enact actual change. So a lot of radical feminist literature draws on Marxist discourse to talk about like overthrowing and destroying the state apparatus in order to enact genuine change. It's predicated on the idea that like if every institution is built upon a cultural and social thing, then they inevitably reproduce that cultural and social thing, even if there are like attempts to kind of rectify through like more liberal or like legal progressive means. So it's radical feminism is usually predicated on the idea of revolution, but it's also incredibly diverse in the way that like different radical feminists approach different things. So there's Kate Millett's radical feminism that talks about like I call them lesbian communes. I can't remember what the actual term that she uses is, but essentially the idea that women need to remove themselves entirely from men in society, and that includes engaging in or using other women to fulfill sexual need, rather than necessarily relying on men for literally anything. So it looks like forming communes, and I call them lesbian communes because it's the easiest way of like talking about like that full separation aspect. She might actually call them lesbian communes, but don't quote me on that. So that's one flavour of radical feminism. Another flavour of radical feminism is Shulamith Firestone. So she was on the first slide. I can't go back, but you can go back. She was the woman on the right on the first slide. And Shulamith Firestone's thesis essentially is that women's reproductive capacity, i.e. the weakness that is incurred through being pregnant and then birthing, necessarily will always be taken advantage of by men, and so the only means of like full liberation is, alongside revolution, the development of a technology that could relieve women from pregnancy. I've done air quotes where I think words may or may not be like politically contentious. Those are two very like different ideas, although note the fact that they're all like, those are very two different ideas about like the need for like revolution and where radicalism is needed, but they are both under the term radical feminism. I also want to add here, the word TERF, which is trans exclusionary radical feminist, is used a lot in debating and in real life. It's a pet peeve of mine that people use the word TERF to just talk about people who are not radical feminists. So Kate Millett, for example, the lesbian commune woman, she is a TERF. So she was an academic at St Hilda's College in Oxford University, and I think she either left or was removed from her post for being a TERF, but her understanding of the way that women need to remove themselves from society was predicated on the idea of like biological sex being deterministic, and so she was very much against the idea of trans women being considered women, because she thought that being a woman was predicated on the experience of growing up from birth. So that is a TERF, and that carries all of the negative connotations of preventing the access of trans people to gain like legal recognition as women, and also the denying of their own experiences and the own oppression that they will feel inevitably because they are women. And so that is a TERF. J.K. Rowling is not a TERF because she is not a radical feminist. This is a pet peeve of mine. Her idea of like, I want to protect like women only spaces and I like do things for women, that's not radical in any way. That's just, I like the idea of women having legal protections within society. That's pretty mainstream and that's very like liberal. The thing that she, or like liberal in like feminist sense, she is transphobic and she is trans exclusionary, and that is bad, and she dislikes the idea of giving trans women their due legal recognition, and that is bad. But she's not a radical feminist. invariably people will refer to her as a TERF no matter what I say, and I think that like 10 people who watch this video are not necessarily gonna like care that I have this, but this is a personal gripe, and because I've been asked to make this video, I'm going to use it to introduce my personal gripe. There are also radical feminists who are not trans exclusionary, in the sense that like you can believe in radical feminism in the sense of needing a revolution to alleviate oppression against women, and also believe that trans women are as much a part of that process and as much a part of you know, the oppressed group. Yes, pet peeve of mine. Sorry. And then just again, oh, this is just going to be a list of my pet peeves about feminism, or like some parts of feminist movements, or the way that people talk about it in like pop culture. Choice feminism is the idea that every choice made by a woman is a positive choice, i.e. If I, because I'm a woman, choose to like slap you, that is a good choice because I'm a woman and I've made it. It's probably more complicated than that, but it's usually used as that in a debate. I've never seen a choice feminist case win a debate. If you can point at one, then fab. If you can win a debate using choice feminism, then fab, but I've never ever seen it being successful. I said this was going to be a quick video and I've just been ranting for like 15 minutes. But basically, these are some like super basic overview about like information about the feminist movement that hopefully comes in handy in terms of like just vaguely understanding what's going on. Like you might not always need to do this kind of analysis or like use this kind of just conversation within a debate, but when people discuss like the feminist movement, it's usually useful to understand the absolute basics of it in terms of like because if it was like this house as the feminist movement would buy everyone a cupcake, it's probably useful to know the fact that the feminist movement is not kind of some cohesive group. There's no explicit leader of it. It's got a huge history of like splintering and discussion, and there are perpetuations of inequalities within the movement in the way that it discusses like intersectionality. So hopefully this is useful. It also might just be stuff that you already know, so fab. So then moving on to like impacting feminism and feminist movements. In the same way that like people always say like there's a temptation for like novices in debating, or sometimes like good debaters, to try and make a case that like implementing some policy is gonna either cause like revolution or war, and it's generally seen that that's like a bad idea because it's quite a high burden of proof that's necessary for that, and you just don't have time in 7 minutes to do that like 99% of the time. Equally, you're not going to solve the patriarchy. Like it's, you know, if we can't solve it in like real life, I don't think you're going to solve it in 7 minutes in debate land. So I think that like that's just not a good burden to reach for. So in terms of like impacting, I think you just need to try and like make sure that you're actually going for legitimate or like practical achievements, right? We're talking about I'll come back to the second point, but the impacts that we're talking about are like giving some people greater economic control, so like giving greater liquidity to women, like free, like use cash that they can use or whatever, or allowing women-owned businesses to have like a greater capacity to reach success, or allowing more women to enter the high ranks within businesses or whatever. So economic empowerment. Does it look like giving women greater reproductive control? So whether that's like greater distribution of like birth control pills, like condom usage, those kinds of things, like reproductive control within like women's capacity to make choices about their own like birth giving. And that also looks like reproductive control can also look like things like not only like access to resources, but also just like cultural attitudes about reproduction as well. Thirdly, like glass ceiling stuff, this looks like, you know, again, it's similar to economic empowerment, like women capable of reaching like higher areas within, you know, whatever. I'll talk about that more when I talk about some stock analysis. Fourthly, like a political voice or control? So is that putting women or allowing or having more women within like government structures? So if you have women in parliament, then are they going to have like a more centered idea about like charities that support women that are necessary, or policies that could be put in place because of like the epistemic access? Woohoo, bingo. Sorry, those of you who don't know what epistemic access is, it means like basically capacity to know things, but it's also just a term in debating that's become like a bingo word. So anyway, like yeah, women have the sole capacity to know things about women because they are women, right? Like and intersectionality is important here because I, as a white woman, will never understand the experiences of a black woman, and also I, as a cis woman, will never understand the experiences of a trans woman in the way that they are different to my own. Like there's some universality of experience there because we are all like women, but there are diversity that exists within those experiences, and class is also a huge factor here. So that can just be like physical presence in a space can mean the expression and the increased likelihood of policies or policies being put in place that support women of particular specificities. And then fifthly, like physical safety of women. So I was talking about with some of the people in St Andrews last week, the idea of like, what was the motion? It was like, this house would place a curfew on men in areas where there is a high level of violent crime. And that's clearly like tapping into the idea of like improving the physical safety of women, that is like usually in most areas significantly lower than that of men. This is an inexhaustive list of like impacts that are potentially achievable, but a useful starting place to understand the fact that like you're not going to like prevent there from being all inequalities for women, but what you might be able to do is provide some improvement to some women in some places. Returning back to like the second point on the slide, why do CAs set the motion they do, is a useful question that I think people often tell you to ask no matter what kind of a debate we're talking about, but it's particularly useful here, I think, or it's the specific ways that it's useful here rather, is that I'm guilty of this as well. Oftentimes when CAs set motions about things like social justice, they think that they're like a genius and have like fixed something. And so it's a useful question to ask because you're trying to ask yourself like, what particular thing about the world do they think they're fixing? Or like, which particular inequality do they think they're solving here? And then depending on which side of the debate you're on, how does it aim to achieve that? How does it actually access that? Or alternatively, like, how does it fail to do this? How does it potentially exacerbate other problems? How does it exacerbate this problem, etc.? Final point on the slide then. Women exist outside of feminist motions, and I think that in the same way that you can use like econ analysis in motions that are not explicitly about economics, you can also not necessarily use like feminist analysis, but you can also talk about the impacts on women outside of necessarily debates that are explicitly focused on women, because I think that it's important, and this harps back to intersectionality, because this is true not just for women but for every like identity grouping. Different people are impacted by policies differently. So if we're talking about like potentially an econ motion, which is like providing tax breaks to specific companies or legal protection to specific companies in specific areas, it might be useful to think about the way that that potentially impacts women, people of color, the LGBT groupings, like whatever it is. It's useful to generally think about the ways that this can be impactful in a different motion, or the way that this analysis might be applicable elsewhere. Okay, so these are some like stock analysis things that I think can be used. A couple of them I've taken from other people. I will give them credit when we get there. But a lot of them like I've just seen around. I think these are not necessarily like going to be able to be used in like every single debate. We'll see that when we talk about motions at the end of the presentation. But I think that what they are useful for is like they're sometimes usefully applicable, and also you can see the way potentially through a conversation, I'm talking to myself, the way that I've come up with, or that someone else has come up with these particular like analysis examples. On the female gaze then, this was a case that I used in a speech in St Andrews Open 2022. If you're thinking, wow, this motion looks super familiar, it's because you're a top fan, and I use this motion in the art motions presentation that I've done for the SSDC. So big up you. If you don't recognise it, then you suck. The motion is, this house opposes women sexualising themselves in media. I was in opening opposition. The case that I wanted to give was something along the lines of like accessing viewpoints or opinions that are impossible to access otherwise. So this harks back to what I was just saying a bit ago about the fact that like I have a different perspective than someone who is a trans woman, because we have different life experiences, which means that like we have different things that we're capable of offering the world. That's even, maybe not even more true, but it's definitely true between like men and women. So there's this cultural discourse about things called like the male gaze, and in the same way that things on TikTok get picked up as and people become super obsessed with them because male gaze and female gaze is something that is popularly understood on TikTok, and there was all of that debacle about that guy who was like capturing the female gaze when he was just a bit weird. Anyway, this is not about that. What I'm talking about here though specifically, and I think what the true meaning, what my understanding of male gaze, female gaze discourse is that the patriarchy captures cultural hegemony, or rather creates the is directive of culture. So because society was created in such a way that is in many ways oriented around oppressing women, in order to do that, it's not just like institutional or legal processes that are in place, but rather also cultural attitudes that encourage the oppression of women. So this looks like there's a common understanding of things called aggressive and benevolent sexism. Excuse me. And aggressive sexism is like the stuff that you know, like violence against women, preventing women from accessing workplaces because of like legal means. Benevolent sexism is something a bit more subtle. So it's two things. One is like that kind of the white saviorism equivalent. So it's like men thinking that they have to like protect women and save women. If a woman is watching, in the same way that like some people think that a man offering to walk you home is super nice of them and oh, he's such a good guy. In a lot of ways it can also be a means of establishing the fact, or rather a recognition of hierarchy in such a way that is meant to be presented as helpful, or like I'm a good guy. So it's like good guy narratives. So I've been nice to you, therefore there comes with it some sense of one, obligation, and two, reinforcing of power structures. This is not to say that like you can't be nice to women or you're just perpetuating benevolent sexism. It's super complex. I'll link a study thing at the end, or like I'll give it to William to put in the comments of the video, that where it'll explain it infinitely better than I can here. But it's a way of understanding the fact that cultural forces and social forces can push certain ideas that are oriented and created by men. So in the same way, or rather in a similar way that we talk about how the British Empire created and tried to impose certain cultural ideas on its colonies, that's the word. In a similar way, we talk about the fact that men control culture and therefore impose certain specific views and ideas of women. That's the complex discussion of what I'm talking about. You wouldn't do that in a debate because it's too much. All you can say is that because men control a lot of media things, like most media outlets are run by men or funded by men, a lot of like cultural discourse is controlled, like male directors in film, male producers of music, etc., etc., and also just male songwriters a lot of the time. And additionally, because of cultural or like social dominance, men control market. So the idea that like sex sells is often the idea that like showing women naked is a means of selling products, because we're oriented towards this like heteronormative male dominated culture. For all of those reasons, it is very easy to access male perspectives on things, especially like sexuality. Comparatively, it's quite difficult to access things coming solely from a female perspective within this. So the case for this particular debate was women sexualizing themselves. Sorry, women being sexualized is like a symmetric, universal thing that is going to happen. Women sexualizing themselves is the unique means of accessing the female gaze approach to sexuality. So it's the unique means of accessing discussions about things like the female orgasm or the way that women feel good and feel beautiful. This looks like, Cardi B's WAP talking about specific female approaches and the female perspective regarding things like sex. Or we're talking about like Lizzo's music that is talking about very female gaze oriented or female centric ideas of what it is to feel like a happy or upbeat woman enjoying herself, right? So there's a few things here. Note the fact that the comparative is central to the case, and note that the impact here is also pretty accessible. We're just talking about like the capacity of women to access other people or other women in some kind of universal sense. So we're talking about things like, catharsis of some kind of universal experience, but also in a lot of ways we're talking about things that are like orgasm inequality that exists. More discussion about female orgasm brings more attitudes and more opinions to the fore, or rather it becomes a more central consideration, and so there's probably some leveling out of inequality there to a certain degree, but in a lot of ways it's just people being able to access comparative opinions. So that was the kind of case that was run there. I've not given like super detailed or like step-by-step analysis, so sorry, sucks, but maybe that's like an interesting or useful discussion of a case. Okay, so I have messaged Owen and asked him to send me the way that he does this case, because he does it really well and he does it a lot, or he used to do it a lot, and it's so good, but I can't remember how explicitly to do it. So, and he's not gotten back to me, and I really want to finish the video. So if he gets back to me, I'll give it to William. We can put it in the comments. I'm really directing you guys to the comments a lot. And hopefully Owen will do a video at some point, and we'll get him to do it there. But essentially, the gist of the impact, or the gist of the case, is that austerity measures disproportionately impact women, and therefore that's a useful means of clarifying why they're bad or whatever. So in times of hardship, women are usually the first to lose their jobs over men for like cultural reasons, and then additionally they're usually more reliant on services that are state funded. So that means that when austerity measures kick in and public services get reduced, it is women who are disproportionately impacted in a negative sense by this. Again, this is not coherent enough that you could give this in a case, sorry, but either you could do your own research, you can find Owen at some competition, because he's at one like every weekend, and ask, or 3, I will find out and I will add it in the description box or post like a comment on the YouTube video. Okay, I'm going to do this really quickly because I'm conscious that I said this is going to be a quick video, and I think this is going to be my longest one yet. Okay, idols or role models. This is like super simple, very intuitive. having people in a position of power or like high up in a career gives people role models to look up to. It's like, one, it gives young girls maybe the like look of someone who they can move to, or who they can like aspire to be. It gives examples of people breaking the glass ceiling. Visibility is super important, but it's also like signaling to other people, like men probably, that it's possible for women to engage productively in these areas. It means this. Caveat to this, or a good response to this case, is often that like the like Kamala Harris approach, maybe, in that she's the vice president of the United States. She receives a huge amount of like very misogynistic language that's thrown at her, so potentially that acts as, one, a disincentive, or two, every time she fails that becomes like a really useful example for people who want to perpetuate that other idea. So there's like different approaches here, and if you're making the case, you probably want to insulate yourself to either side of this. There's also additionally the capacity to enact top-down change. So if you have a female prime minister, then she can put things in, she's probably more able to put policies in place that are capable of like aiding women with things that are important. Not to reveal too much about my political stature, but you can also have the Margaret Thatcher phenomenon. Okay. Some people are going to disagree with me that she did this, but it is of my and a lot of people's opinion that Margaret Thatcher did a lot of things while she was in power to essentially pull the ladder up from underneath her for a lot of people. That's both like a class thing and also a female thing. She very notably said that she didn't want women in her cabinet because she thought that they were incapable of being like reasonable or whatever. So there exists the phenomena of individuals who can get themselves into a position of power and somehow think that they are either like a unique example of a woman who can do that, or will do things to curtail the capacity of other people to do this. Cool. And then finally, just again, this idea of like this cultural reproductive phenomena, i.e. If you are in a position of particularly like cultural significance, you have quite a significant capacity to potentially influence and shift cultures in a positive light. This looks like maybe a female singer singing about some kind of like pop feminist thing, and it then becomes adopted as like this cultural or rather it becomes accepted into cultural hegemony about like what is significantly important, or rather people accept it to be true. Again, the same thing in like responsiveness applies, in that like it also opens itself up to comparatively more criticism, but then so does everything. So maybe that's a useful kind of discussion there. Okay, this is kind of just a case that I have never given nor seen in a BP debate, but I think would be useful. And it's probably been given in a BP debate. I'm just not a nerd, so I don't watch them all. Sorry to those of you that are currently watching this video. This is talking about like the fact that there exist competing narratives within society, and therefore like legal change can often be considered insufficient to cause that change because of all of the cultural like impacts and the competing narratives that exist. I'm also making a narrative video, so this will be discussed in far more detail in that, but just for a brief overview of this. I got the inspiration for this point because in St Andrews we did a Thursday night debate, which is not BP, we do like formal debates on Thursday nights, in which Parth, who is a senior debater here at St Andrews, gave a very persuasive speech in which they talked about this idea of like laws being insufficient to curtail or to encourage like equality within a high reproduction or a society with high reproduction levels. If you're interested, talk to Parth because they love demography. Maybe they love democracy as well. Cool. Anyway, brief overview of the idea. It's the idea that like legal changes don't necessarily have that social or cultural impact in the way that you would expect them to. So I can pass a law tomorrow that says, or I mean, this is useful. I can pass a law that says you cannot drink below the age of 18, but as long as there exists like cultural or culturally accepted phenomena that you do drink below 18, that's probably going to have like a limited impact. So the capacity to police is super important, so like it might not necessarily be that, but that's an example of like where laws are potentially insufficient. But additionally, like I can pass a law that says that you cannot ask women in interviews about whether or not they're planning on having a child soon, but that doesn't stop the intuition that exists that a woman who is around the age of like between 25 and 35 is probably in her highest current period of like pregnancy likelihood. So I can't ask her if she's planning on having a child, but that doesn't stop like either overt explicit thoughts that she might go and get pregnant, or like more subtle ingrained ideas of this. So this doesn't necessarily have the same legal impact that you would expect it to, because there exist competing narratives, and then like also just like visual and social cues that exist. So paternity leave extension doesn't necessarily mean that people will take that up, or even if they do, doesn't mean that they will take on a more significant or equal parental role. Yes. I've put the question at the end, which is there such thing as choice free from coercion, because I'm a bit wanky. I'm not going to talk about that, so just food for thought. There you go. So another like narrative example, again, go see the specific video for a more like in-depth narrative analysis, talking about like widening access or self-selection capacity. A useful case is sometimes that like bad narratives are going to symmetrically exist. So if it's a debate like this house as the feminist movement would adopt X narrative, ask the question, what is this trying to solve? And then think, well, there is probably going to be things, bad narratives being pushed, like the narrative that exists of like boys can't cry is probably going to exist. So oftentimes a useful case to make is adding a competing narrative will allow for people to opt into the other narrative that exists, right? So rather than just being told boys can't cry, if I'm being told both boys can't cry and then someone else is saying boys can cry whenever they want, I have a greater choice capacity in the second scenario than in the first, because there are just more options available to me. So this can allow for a certain self-selection capacity. Again, I'll go into much more detail about this in the actual narratives video, but this can be useful because a lot of feminist debates can be about like narratives either that the feminist movement adopts or that specific women adopt or whatever. Cool. Okay, so just then on achievable burdens, we talked about this a little bit already. So again, you're not going to get rid of the patriarchy. There's just a few things to be conscious of here. I'm not going to go into super amount of depth, but these are things that should be occurring in your head whenever you're in any debate really, but debates of these kinds specifically. So like the reach of the movement, who are they capable of talking to? Like with the internet, you're capable of talking to more people than you were before, but then like physical protests or like, you know, real life protests have a greater, you know, physical presence in spaces. So like storming buildings or like standing outside of places or whatever. And then like the competing ideas or narratives idea like section is also important to think of. And then in terms of like impacts and burden impacts, do some people feel better or safer? Are some people richer than they were before? Think about what it means to actually like change something within a debate and not just have a conversation about how much it like sucks to be a woman or whatever. And then I think it's also important to understand what trade-off you're making. Like things aren't, nothing can, there's very few debates and no debates that should be set will have a silver bullet. So it's usual that you're making a trade-off. And so weighing becomes super important here about like which metrics we are deciding the debate on and giving me reasons as to why that's necessarily the case. So that's super important there. Okay, so in front of me are some motions. I'm covering one of them with my head, but that's fine. This is like the section that's going to make the video look super long and unattractive. Well, the video is already quite long. So I'm just going to go through some of these motions. I'm not going to do anything particularly in depth or come up with any cases for them, but I'll have a brief conversation about maybe what's going to go through my head the first 30 seconds or like minute of prep time, so that kind of highlighting how like ideas can come out. So on the first one, it reads, this House believes that the feminist movement should oppose the commercialization of reproduction, e.g. sale of ova, commercial surrogacy. First thoughts coming into my head are things along the lines of like economic empowerment for women. Seems like it's going to be a pretty crucial thing for opposition bench. But more importantly, I think also note the fact that this is the feminist movement doing something, so expressing some kind of oppositional opinion. So what does it likely look like that's going to take the form of? Is it like internet postings, like those like Instagram graphics or whatever that get put out? Is it protests outside of surrogacy clinics, if those are like a big thing? What kind of method is being adopted? And this looks like probably important to do some strategic framing. I talk more about this in, I think, my movements video. So what is the most helpful means of providing like likelihood analysis of like how the movement does this, or how this opposition takes place? So like government ideas is clearly like commercialization of reproduction is bad because it promotes the idea of like women as some kind of commodity, or reproduction as some kind of commodity, which is like playing into these ideas of women being like cash cows in some kind of capacity, legitimizing certain things, etc., etc. So does standing against this kind of thing create some kind of consistency with other ideas in the feminist movement? Okay, that's my initial thoughts for that motion. Moving on to the next one, this House believes that the feminist movement should focus significant time, platform and resources towards combating benevolent sexism. So when I was talking about aggressive and benevolent sexism before, I imagine there would be an info slide with this debate, although you can't always see that on Hello Motions, that would tell you what benevolent sexism was. Without that, and just with my own understanding of what it is, I'm looking at this and the trade-off question comes into head. Like, importantly, note the fact that like if you're directing time, platform and resource towards this, it means you're directing it away from other things. So this looks like, rather than the feminist movement necessarily providing like time or resources to women who are battling things like domestic abuse or very aggressive forms of sexism, like providing legal aid to battles, it looks like directing those resources towards fighting things that are very, or much more like subtle and culturally created. So whether that's like attempting to shift education systems that are educating children in a way that then instills better views further forward, or whatever, it's a discussion about how that necessarily takes place. And I think that characterization of what that focus looks like will be really important, or would be really important to this debate. On the next one, this House supports the creation of women-only economic zones in Saudi Arabia. I've done this motion before, and I wanted to put it in because I wanted to show that like there's like the econ stuff, but I don't really want to talk about it that much. The idea of like women-only economic zones, probably, particularly in Saudi Arabia, and areas where there's like this very significant legal restrictions that exist on women. We're looking at the creation of whether this looks like the creation of areas in which women can do business where they otherwise couldn't at all. So is this giving women a greater amount of power because they would never have it before? Does it create some kind of excuse as to why women are excluded elsewhere? Is there some kind of like physical safety capacity? If it's a women-only economic zone, does that look like only women can make purchases in this zone? If so, it's reliant on women having enough capital to engage in these areas sufficiently that businesses could survive. So if women do not have control of their own capital, or if there would be a huge time lag in the amount of time it would take for women who engage in these zones to gain capital to spend, so liquidity, then is it going to be successful? I think are all important considerations. Next one, this House believes that, provided that your husband's income is sufficient to support this decision, this House would take a career break to raise the child. Again, I imagine that there's an info slide here. This is an actor's motion, so you have to provide actor analysis incentives. I talk about this more in, I think, my narratives video, but you'll have to watch them all to see. No, I don't. It's in my movements video. Okay. So understanding the incentives that exist for this particular actor in making this decision about whether or not to take a career break for raising the child. So you're looking about like what the outcomes look like, what their priorities exist, yada yada yada. Next, this house would apply a lower rate of income tax to women. Again, econ stuff. Another motion. A lot of these motions about like feminist movements that are applied to women are often actually centered around means of trying to provide economic liberation or increased economic capacity for women. So again, you're looking at things like, you know, backlash, whether or not this actually is a solution, because income tax is like applied at different rates to different income levels. So is the amount of money that women would get back sufficient enough to provide any kind of resource capacity, or like, as in, if all men have like more money than women, or like a lot of men have more money than women, is it just because men can exist higher up the chain of income, in which case the income tax break is not necessarily going to be sufficient, blah blah blah. People could probably do that much better than I could. And then again, why did I put so many econ things in this? Okay, this house believes that microfinance organizations, blah blah blah, should offer microfinance loans, and that reads in developing nations to women. I think I put this in. I put this in here specifically for the developing nations bit, because I think that this is a interesting example of a debate that could maybe be situated in how to provide economic capital or control to women in areas where they're typically neglected. So this is a specific motion that references women, but I think this might also be useful for like developing nations motions to think about and consider the way that different people are capable of accessing aid or financial, you know, benefits or whatever. Cool. You can probably do a lot more work with these motions than I have, but I hope this is like a useful way of beginning to think about things. This is the end of the presentation. Just for length's sake, I'm not going to go over the book recommendations or like article recommendations that I have to here, but I'll make sure that William includes them in the I was going to say info slide, but that's not what it is. The video description. So this was feminism. This was feminism. This was feminism and debating. Woohoo!